Hey everybody, Yankee here. Have you ever wanted a Glock chambered in 5.7x28? Have you ever said, I really like Glocks and the way they work and the way they're built, but I'd like to try the 5.7x28 round. I think that round is pretty cool. Well, Glock has not made a 5.7x28, but you can buy this. This is the PSA Rock 5.7. And this gun is basically a Glock chambered in 5.7x28. And today I want to do a quick range review of it and show you what I'm talking about when I say that. Now you might look at this gun and say, well, that doesn't look much like a Glock to me. It's got kind of a different shape. It's got a long barrel, blah, blah, blah. Well, really where it counts, in most ways, this gun is very much like a Glock. It even has a very Glock-like trigger. It's even got the little dongle and everything there. If you look at the inside here, now it's not going to look exactly like a Glock, but it's very similar. If you went through and tore every piece out of this and compared it to a Glock, going to be not that different. If you look at it here next to a Glock frame, you're going to see that this is a little more encased and the proportions are a little different, but overall the mechanisms aren't very dissimilar. PSA makes Gen 3 Glock clones pretty much, and the clones themselves are more similar to the Glock, but really there ain't that much difference between all of these. If you look at the inside of the slides on the Glock here and the PSA here, you can see very similar. And if you look at the Glock next to the PSA Rock, you can see, well, it's not that different. It does look different, but pretty much functions the same way. Just like how in the Glock, this little piece right here on the firing pin is pushed backwards to lock the firing pin in place and to actuate the firing pin. On the Rock, that little tab right there basically functions the same way. In fact, I would say the biggest differences in these guns is their aesthetic. This one just looks a little different. But their Gen 3 Glock clones also look considerably different than a Glock. It's mostly just an aesthetics thing. There's not much difference in the way they function. This is a striker-fired 5.7x28 that shoots, works, etc. very much like a Glock. In fact, it's quite a bit different than other 5.7x28s you might see, like my FN 5.7 here. This gun is hammer-fired, as is the Ruger 5.7, the Smith & Wesson 5.7. They're all hammer-fired guns. And this one very clearly has a safety. The Rock, as I said, is a striker-fired gun with no manual safety, but it does have the little trigger dongle, much like a Glock. So as I said, I think this is very much like having a Glock that's a 5.7x28. Now, this might be where you're saying, well, it's not as good a quality as a Glock, and it's not as reliable as a Glock, and it doesn't shoot as well as a Glock. Well, I'm going to disagree on that too. When I compare the build quality of this to a Glock, just like when I compared the Dagger to a Glock, it's very similar and in some ways better. I actually like this better, especially things like grip frame and stuff like that. I like the way the angle is. I like the way it's cut better. Just everything about it I like better physically than a Glock. But is it reliable? Is it, something you can count on? Well, so far what I've found is yes. I took this gun down to my range and put over 200 rounds through this gun, which is rare because this is not a cheap gun to shoot. And I usually don't shoot that much, period, much less when it's expensive ammo like a 5.7x28. But I found that this gun shoots very well. It's got a nice trigger. The reset is nice and clean. It's not a great trigger. It's a polymer trigger. I would put it pretty much on level with a standard Glock trigger, but it hit the target every time. It's a very accurate gun. Out of all those rounds, I only had one failure with this gun, and it was when I put only 5 rounds in the magazine. Because sometimes I'll load a magazine 10 rounds, 20 rounds, because these hold quite a few rounds. But sometimes I'll just put 5 in there because I want to shoot a 5-round group. And the first time I just put 5 rounds in this, it failed to eject on the first round. It did not cycle properly. And then I did the same thing with my 5.7 to see, well, is it just this gun or will the 5.7 not cycle if I only put 5 rounds in it? Had the same failure once with the 5.7, not on the first magazine, but on the second. So I've learned the lesson of not just putting 5 rounds in them, but I don't think you would ever be doing that if you were carrying them. And after that, I was able to put 5 rounds in them multiple times and not have a failure from either of them. So I don't know if it was just a fluke or maybe I limp wristed it and it's susceptible to limp wristing when there's only 5 rounds in the magazine or something. Maybe that's the case with any 5.7x28. I've only shot a few different ones, so I don't know. But like I said, other than that, no failures, perfectly reliable, and exceptionally accurate. The iron sights it came with, which are suppressor height, were right on target from the factory. I didn't have any problems with it. I was able to hit everything I aimed at every time I aimed, and I was able to get nice little groups when I wanted to do a group, or at least as nice a group as I can get. The trigger came in at just over 5 pounds on pretty much every pull, very consistent trigger pull, and the reset is nice and short and very tactile. You can hear it, you can feel it, and that's a very short reset. You don't hardly have to pull the trigger at all once it resets. Although I'm not someone who shoots from reset because I shoot revolvers more than anything else, and the last thing you want to do is short stroke a trigger. So I've never mastered that shooting from the reset. So based on my testing so far, and I do want to do some more testing with it, I can say I have no problem with it as far as reliability is concerned, other than that one failure I had that I also had with my FN. Didn't have a single problem with it. Now I would like to try it with some different magazines. I only have the one magazine, but it works really nicely. It was completely reliable. The trigger is every bit as good as a Glock. In fact, it might be a little bit lighter than most of my Glocks, simply because it doesn't function exactly as far as the firing pin is concerned, but still a nice, reliable, easy to predict trigger. And as far as looks go, I think it beats Glock. I just think this is actually a good looking gun. I like the way this looks better than my FN 5.7. Now, do I think it's as good a gun as an FN 5.7? Well, that's a different story. But I'm not comparing it to that right now. I'm comparing it to a Glock. Because in the end, I don't think this gun is as comparable to like an FN 5.7 or a Ruger 5.7 or any of those guns as it is to a Glock that just so happens to be chambered in the 5.7x28 round. That's why I said at the beginning, I think this is for people who have always said, I'd like to have a Glock chambered in that caliber. And you want to know one of the best things about this gun, other than it being reliable and good looking and having a fairly decent trigger for a striker fired gun? It's also inexpensive. These are not expensive at all to build from PSA, and you get to choose what you want. You get to choose the color you want, you get to choose the type of barrel you want, you get to choose different cut slides, so you have all kinds of options when you're building it, sights, etc. So you basically get to build it from the ground up the way you want it. I chose Sniper Green for both the frame and the slide on this one, and then I went with a bronze barrel that's threaded, which I already had, of course, because getting one in the state of Washington would be impossible because of our law. So I obviously already had that, and of course already had the magazine too, since this is the 23 round magazine. So I had a lot of stuff for it already, and that made it really cheap to put it together. But even if you're putting it together from scratch, not expensive at all, way cheaper than a Glock. So in the end, like I was saying, if you're someone that would like something like a Glock, but chambered in 5.7x28, this might be the gun for you. If you were wanting something like the FN 5.7, well then get the FN. Because like I said, they are different. But this is, like I said, very much like a Glock, functions like a Glock, feels like a Glock, shoots like a Glock, but has 23 rounds plus 1 of 5.7x28.